Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Maggie Mahan, the Assistant Director for Community Engagement with the State Historical Society of Missouri. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to bring you the fourth installment in our author conversation series, which highlights contributors to the Missouri Historical Review, an award-winning scholarly quarterly, which has served as the cornerstone of the State Historical Society of Missouri's publication program since 1906. Featuring current scholarship on all facets and periods of the state's history, receiving the review is a benefit of State Historical Society of Missouri membership. You can visit our website at shsmo.org to learn more and join or renew your membership. Today, oral historian Sean Rost will be in conversation with David Balducci, retired from the U.S. Department of Labor in Washington, D.C., for a discussion of his 2021 Missouri Historical Review article, Harry Truman's Tour of Duty as Missouri Reemployment Director, Transition from Local to National Politician. And so I will turn things over to Sean Rost to start the conversation.
Thank you very much, Maggie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And of course, thank you to David Balducci for this wonderful presentation we're going to have. To begin with, and to really jump into the topic here, David, introduce yourself to us and to our viewers here and explain how your career background led you to research this article we're going to focus on today.
Certainly, Sean, and thank you very much, and to John Brenner and the other team members at the Missouri Historical Review for all they've done. It's an honor to be with you here this afternoon to talk about Harry Truman's short stint as the Missouri Director of the National Reemployment Service, a part-time job he held, working 2 or 3 days a week from late October of 1933 to middle of May 1934. It's my belief that this job was a hinge point in Truman's career progression from local to national politician. Hi, everyone. I'm David Balducci. I am retired from the U.S. Department of Labor, where I worked for 34 years. I am a subject matter expert in unemployment insurance and employment service programs. This article took me 25 years to research, working on my own with starts and stops and roadblocks and a lot of dead ends. To answer your question, Sean, there actually were 2 policy influence or strains that attracted me to this particular project. In my salad days, I was assigned to work with a political appointee who had come back into government. His name was William L. Batt Jr. And I soon found out that Bill had led a speechwriting team in Harry Truman's 1948 presidential campaign. I learned a lot about administering public policy from Bill. And from time to time, he'd regale me with stories about working in the Truman era and also high positions he held in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Now, the next stream that sort of led me to this particular project was in the mid-1990s, an issue arose within a state about whether or not they could privatize their public employment offices. And it caused us at the department to go back and research the purpose and origin of the program. And we found then, as today, that individuals who are referred to jobs in public employment offices must be done so on the basis of their skills and not through political affiliation or patronage or any type of other favoritism, but must be done so impartially and without bias. As a result of this research, I found out that there was a temporary agency called the National Reemployment Service. And I found out, in addition to that, that Harry Truman had some role, but it was all very blurry and there wasn't the detail that I wanted. So I spent 25 years trying to bring it into sharper focus. Sean, back to you.
Thank you very much. Now, in doing this project over 25 years, there's a lot of research components to that. What documents are you looking at? What archives are you going through? What sites are you really visiting and consulting with to help you along in that research process?
Right. Well, I went to a lot of places. Let me share a few of the research institutions that I went to and researched this article. I think I need to say first, though, that I wanted to look at this issue from the bottom up. I did not want to look at it from Truman down. I wanted to understand the organizational structure that Truman worked in, who he networked with, what he learned every day, what he had to do, how did it help his career ladder progression in public policy. And so I first started out at the Willard Wirtz Library in the U.S. Department of Labor in Washington, D.C. I started out in the card catalog and then worked my way back into the stacks. I had the good fortune in 1997 to interview an individual, one of the three public health nurses in Jackson County, Missouri, 93-year-old Margaret Ferguson. And she shared with me a lot about what it was like to live during the early 1930s in the Kansas City, Missouri area. And it helped me a lot. I was able, through her, I think, to become a temporary resident of the period. I moved on to the Truman Library, and all the people were always very helpful, the archivists at the Truman Library. But I will tell you, when I went there the first time, they said, there's not much here in our files about Harry Truman's stint as the Federal Reemployment Director in Missouri. So I moved on to the National Archives, too, in College Park, Maryland. And I would go up to the archives in College Park, and I would go through the Bureau of Employment Security files, memo by memo by memo. And finally, if I could cue you for the first photograph, I went to the Library of Congress. Now, some of you who have seen the movie National Treasure remember the large reading room of the Library of Congress. Well, in the Library of Congress, I was seated, I never forget it, it was December 29th, 2015, and I had a huge book. And this book was projects in Missouri under the Civil Works Administration. And I was trying to find the connection between those projects and individuals working in them and the National Reemployment Service, and I was having little luck until I turned the page and I found this photograph. And I write about it in the article. This is a conference that Truman attended in January of 1934 on public welfare in Columbia, Missouri, and these individuals are the speakers. What is significant about this photograph, it is the only photograph I have found of Truman during that period where in the legend, he is identified as the Missouri director of the National Reemployment Service. Sean?
Thank you very much for that. Yeah. Now, most people, perhaps attending today and in general, know Truman as a president. We just had President's Day not too many days ago, and as a vice president, maybe as a U.S. Senator from Missouri, and even a fewer perhaps know him as a presiding judge of Jackson County, but probably not many know him as Missouri's reemployment director. Why was this appointment so significant to warrant further research and eventual article?
Well, let's step back for a second. Let's look where Truman was in the fall of 1933 in terms of his own career progression. He was at a political dead end. He was presiding judge of Jackson County, Sean, but that position was, by tradition, term limited. He had made a faint attempt to run for governor, and he had lost out on that. After helping redraw the congressional map of his hometown area with a possible bid to run for Congress, the local political boss, Tom Pendergast, did not endorse him. And in January of 1934, he was passed over in a position as tax collector in Jackson County. Now, a lot of biographies give a lot of good information about that, but there's little ink given to his role as reemployment director. And I thought about this, and I think it's because the issues are so complex. There was a cornucopia of programs during the first 100 days of the New Deal, and this was one of them. Also, the information is hard to find, and it's hard to understand. But every time I'd find a clue or another factoid, I found out how important this job was to Harry Truman. Let me give you an example from the article. In 1957, Harry and Bess were celebrating their 38th wedding anniversary. And as a gift to his wife, for each year of their marriage, he wrote down the most important event in that year of their 38 years together. And in 1933, he wrote employment director. Sean, back to you.
That is significant, certainly. Now, you mentioned the New Deal there, and certainly for the people who have studied the New Deal era, there's a number of what has been called the alphabet soup of programs, right? The CCC, the WPA, the AAA, the NRA, the list can go on and on and on. Explain to us what this NRS was and what the CWA was, both in Missouri as well as in the United States during the Great Depression.
All right, this is one where we need to take a little time. Let me slow down a bit. Let's look at what was going on nationally to kind of refresh everybody. And then let's look at part of the organizational structure to support the elimination of joblessness within the country. When Franklin Roosevelt took office in March of 1933, 1 out of every 4 American workers was jobless. The rate of unemployment was 25%. All right. Compare that to April of 2020 when we shut down the economy as a result of the pandemic. Highest unemployment rate since before World War II, 14.8% unemployment. But in St. Louis and some other parts of Missouri, the rate of unemployment was 30% or more. Now in Kansas City, things were a bit better. There was a lot of construction going on. So much so that Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's relief administrator, sent people to Kansas City in the summer of 1933 to see what was going on. In early 1933, sort of nationally, there were only 120 employment offices under public administration, and 7 of them were in Missouri under the leadership of Mary Edna Cruzan, C-R-U-Z-E-N. She ran the state employment service, state-run employment service, all right? And in Washington, the agency that was responsible to help states build these state-run employment offices was the entity named the United States Employment Service within the Department of Labor, okay? Now, within the Department of Labor, they quickly realized that working with the states, they could not stand up offices, state-run offices quickly enough to meet the job, public works needs and jobs needs of workers quickly enough. So they indicated they needed to create a different entity quickly. And within the U.S. Employment Service, they created a separate division called the National Reemployment Service. Its job was to build quickly, stand up across the country, federal reemployment offices, not state-run, but federal reemployment offices to meet the needs of public works and civil works. And in the summer of 1933, the director of the U.S. Employment Service, W. Frank Persons, P-E-R-S-O-N-S, and his deputy, Walter Burr, B-U-R-R, remember that name, Walter Burr, a Missourian, they selected an individual to run the federal reemployment offices in Missouri named Martin Lewis. Martin Lewis was an engineer and a Republican. Now, at its peak throughout the country, I think it's probably important to note that there were 3,271 of these federal reemployment offices, and at its peak, 109 of them were in Missouri. Now, that's these local offices that are going to refer people to civil and public works jobs. But what about the projects themselves? Well, there was an entity called the Federal Public Works Administration, and its mission was to build these large construction projects that were going to employ lots and lots of people. But as the winter approached of 1933 and 1934, not enough of these big construction projects were up and running. So Harry Hopkins and his team had an idea. Let's create a national jobs program, a temporary jobs program that would provide individuals with a paycheck. All right? Roosevelt liked the idea very much. They would be projects of civil works, that is, local projects, meaningful projects, not leaf raking, things that needed to be done, and state projects. And we would fund them from Washington. All right? So Roosevelt liked the idea. He said, let's do it. Let's try it. And he established through executive order the Civil Works Administration. And they would be known as civil works projects throughout the country to differentiate them from large public works projects. The program would only last 7 months, and they would employ some 4.2 million people to reduce unemployment and provide people with paychecks that fed them and bought them coal and heat during the winter months. And the National Reemployment Service, federal reemployment offices, would refer these individuals, would recruit and refer these individuals to these civil works and later public works projects. That's a lot there, I know, but I hope that explains or answers your question. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much for explaining that. And that really provides a lot of great context there on both of those New Deal programs. Now, in that context, of course, with the establishment of these programs, and you mentioned some people that are connected to Missouri, people connected to the federal program, how then does Harry S. Truman become Missouri Reemployment Director?
Well, I think this response showcases, I think, I found some of his character and integrity. Let's think about this for a second. In early 1933, Tom Pendergast could not have known all of the federal funds that would be coming into Missouri through public works and civil works. But when it became evident that there was a lot of money going to be flowing in, Tom Pendergast did not want reemployment run by a Republican in Missouri. And he went to Jim Farley, Roosevelt's campaign manager, and Senator Bennett Clark of Missouri, and he tried to get Martin Lewis fired. All right? Now, Walter Burr, remember I mentioned Walter Burr? Walter Burr knew Truman, and he knew this type of job would be in his wheelhouse. So, and he knew what was up with respect to Martin Lewis's tenure. And so he gave Harry Truman a call late afternoon, early evening, and said, Judge, I think we have an opportunity for you in the Roosevelt administration. Can you come immediately to Washington? Truman said, I'll be there. Well, the next morning, Truman gets a telegram from Senator Bennett Clark and says basically two things. One, I'll support you for this job to take the place of Martin Lewis as the federal reemployment director in Missouri. And two, I've been trying to get Martin Lewis fired since last summer. That did not set well with Harry Truman. He knew Martin Lewis. He knew what a good job he was doing. So Truman gets in his car and drives to Jefferson City. And he goes to the National Reemployment Service headquarters in rooms 419 A and B in the Capitol, where Lewis had set up headquarters. And he announces that he will have no part in seeing his friend, Martin Lewis, ousted from his job that he's been doing a good job in. Now, let me move the story to the next morning. And if you could put up the next photograph. It's a building at 1724 F Street in Washington, D.C. Truman arrives at this building right here. This is the headquarters of the U.S. Employment Service in Washington and the National Reemployment Service. Today, it houses some special trade representative staff and other executive office buildings, but it's the same building. Nothing has changed, including the doors. Truman goes up to that building on Saturday, October 21st, and he sees Walter Burr. And he says, Walter, I am not going to accept this job. if I know that my friend Martin Lewis is going to be ousted, canned from his job? And Walter says, Judge, we are not going to fire Martin Lewis. As a matter of fact, I need him. I need him as my special troubleshooter, and I want him to do the good things he's been doing in Missouri throughout the nation. Truman quickly says, I'll accept the job then on these conditions. One is I don't have to leave my job as the presiding judge in Jackson County because that's my job. I'm not going to leave that job. Two, I will work part-time pro bono for the government and except for expenses, and I only work 2 or 3 days a week. Burr agrees. Truman goes back to Kansas City. The next week, he meets with Harry Hopkins, who's floating this idea of a civil works program, a civil works administration. And the first memo, Sean, that I can find that Truman writes and asks a question on a policy in Washington is, I went to Jefferson City and I went to Washington and back. How do I get paid for my expenses? November 6, 1933.
How did he actually do within this role as director? What does the data say? But also, what did his contemporaries at the time think and reflect on in terms of his time as director?
Well, let me talk about this in pieces, and I'll get to the data probably at the last. This is the first time that Truman actually ran a federal civilian program. He hired and promoted individuals. He had an immediate staff of direct reports in Jefferson City of 7 individuals. And he talked to the press. He was the reemployment guy, Sean. He was the guy that said that the recovery program of the Roosevelt administration is going to get the economy back on the rails, and here's what we're doing. He had a staff he had a remit of 284 individuals throughout the state in those 109 local offices, both managers, interviewers, and clerks. The first, and he also asked for and received help from time to time from 2 other individuals. Martin Lewis, you remember his name, who came and helped him, and also another individual who worked for the state-run employment service named Neil Williams, who was a veteran specialist. And the first memo that I could find that Truman sent out to all local offices in all communities, which heightened his name visibility, was a memo explaining how veterans' preference would be handled in the referral of workers to civil works and public works jobs. And finally, he also attended forums and conferences. And if you could put up the next photograph, that'd be great. I should tell all the participants that I'm actually going to do something. Sean and I cooked up a little something different. We are going to ask a question after I explain what this photograph is. As you can see, as it's labeled, it was a conference held in Washington in April of 1934. And I'll tell you what the purpose is, and then I'll ask the question, and you can write it in the chat box if you care to, if you have an idea, if you speculate, or if you know the answer to it. I don't know the answer, and I'm seeking your help on it. Truman went to Washington along with other state directors there, and that was taken at the Red Cross building at 18th and E Street Northwest in April. He drove to it and drove back. The purpose of the meeting was that the Civil Works Administration had terminated, and they were brought together to expand recruitment and referral services to private employers. And that was the purpose of this meeting. Now, here's the interesting thing, in addition to what the purpose of the meeting was. Truman drove back to Independence. We know that. We know everything, all his expenses to and from. But he made an interesting trip back. He went a southern route. He went south on Route 29, which is the same road that General Lee would travel down to Charlottesville, and he stopped in Charlottesville, and then he went over to Nashville. My question is, why did Truman take a southern route home, and why do you think he stopped in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Nashville, Tennessee, before back home to Independence, Missouri? That's the question. Now, while everyone, if they care to write a response to that, and we'll pick it up in the Q&A, Sean informs me, I'll talk a little bit about the data, what you asked for, Sean. Nationally, in 1933 and 1934, nationally, the National Reemployment Service placed 48.1% of the individuals who registered for work. But in Missouri, the rate of placement was 58.8%. I would also want to share that 151,671 individuals were placed in Missouri, and as many as 136,000 can be attributable to Harry Truman's tenure of service as the Missouri Federal Reemployment Director. Now, if you could put up the last photo, I know it's a small one, but I wanted to make certain we talked about the Civil Works Administration a bit. What you'll see here is a group of workers in Washington, Missouri. And this is a typical project that was performed in Missouri and in other states. These individuals are receiving a paycheck. They work on short-term projects. Here, they're rehabbing a school playground. There were 3,323 of these projects in Missouri alone, in local areas, and there were 188 state projects of this type. And the CWA, in the short 5 to 7 months that it existed, brought $19 million into the state of Missouri. Sean, back to you.
I guess for a final question to consider in terms of the context of Truman as employment director, and certainly the stats that tell us what he did in that role, why leave? If he's so successful, if he's doing well, what causes him to step down from that position?
Sure. Well, I think I've actually uncovered some new historical information here, and I'll share with you my take on this. Let's remember, Truman was in a temporary, non-paying job, and his paying job as presiding judge was ending. In the spring of 1934, Governor Park, Democratic Governor Park, had given Truman another political chore. That is to go out and campaign for a state bond issue that was on the ballot, a $10 million bond issue. Truman said he would do it if he could bring along a couple other individuals. Who did he bring? And they asked for leave from their jobs and received that temporary leave. Martin Lewis and Neil Williams. Now, why? All of them were veterans. All of them were members of the American Legion. And all of them were associated statewide with reemployment efforts. And the $10 million bond issue was about bringing jobs into Missouri. And the last point is the effort was bipartisan because remember, Martin Lewis was a Republican. So they were going around the state and campaigning for this bond issue. And as other people have said, wonderful biographers have said, Truman was in Warsaw, Missouri, and he gets a call from Jim Elward, the Democratic chair, and Jim Pendergast, Tom Pendergast's nephew. And they tell him, we have something for you. We need to see you immediately. Truman says, can't do that immediately. I have speaking engagements on the bond campaign. So they arranged to meet in Sedalia around 5 o'clock in the evening at the Terry Hotel. Truman and his coterie go to Windsor, Missouri, and campaign for the bond issue on the back of a flatbed truck in the afternoon. And then they drive down to Sedalia, walk into the Terry Hotel. Truman agrees to run in the primary for the Senate. And then Truman and his coterie and the two Jims go upstairs and meet with a business roundtable to again speak about the bond campaign, supporting the bond campaign. And Truman tells them that this bond issuance will bring 16,000 jobs into Missouri. Truman has one more bond speaking stop in Columbia on Friday, May 11th. And then on Saturday, he calls Walter Burr and says that he has to resign because he's going to run for the Senate. On Monday, May 14th, he resigns officially in a letter, and we have a copy of that letter, and I quote it in the article, and it's written on stationery that says U.S. Department of Labor, U.S. Employment Service, National Reemployment Service. The point is, he works for W. Frank Persons and Walter Burr. Some scholars have indicated he worked for Harry Hopkins. He did not work for Harry Hopkins. He worked for the U.S. Employment Service, and he resigned. Truman goes on to win the primary and the general election, but that's not all the story, Sean. Earlier that summer, you remember the building I showed, 1724 F Street in Washington? All right. Earlier that summer, Mary Edna Curzon, remember her? She was the Commissioner of Labor for the state-run employment service in Missouri. She goes to Washington to meet with a gentleman by the name of James Dotson. He was the personnel and budget guy. He wasn't a program guy or a policy guy. He was the budget guy. And she had come into Washington. Mr. Dotson did an oral interview with the Truman Library in August of 1970. And here is what he said. And then I sort of affirmed it through some additional research that I did. Dotson says that Mary Edna Curzon came to his desk and sat down in a chair next to him and said, Mr. Dotson, do you know that the National Reemployment Service is going to elect Harry Truman, senator from Missouri? And he recalls, he said, how so, Ms. Curzon? She said to him, Mr. Dotson, every individual that is sent out on an interview or is placed in a job gets a form or a piece of paper with Harry Truman's signature or bearing his name. Now that's good politics. That's Harry Truman politics.
Pointing out Harry Truman is one of the prime examples of someone who goes on to large and great things in the United States as reemployment director. Were there other big names in other states or even in Missouri who were affiliated with the reemployment office as well?
I think yes, there were other individuals who acquitted themselves very well, but none who reached the status of Harry Truman. I would like to answer that question, Sean, that I posed to the audience generally about why did Truman go to Charlottesville and Nashville?
Oh, sure.
May I do that?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think if you know Truman, and a lot of you do who are on the call, Truman had a very strong affection for Thomas Jefferson and Andy Jackson. And those two towns happened to be where those former presidents lived. Now think of it. He went down to Charlottesville. He probably stopped at Monticello, and then he went over and stopped at the Hermitage near Nashville. So I think that he got in touch with his roots. The thing that this job, I think, provided Truman in a very real way is his ardor for national politics. He got to meet some of the influence makers, and I think that's what you're talking about. He met Frances Perkins. He talked to her. I talk about that in the article. He owed her a lot. He met Harry Hopkins. I mean, Harry Hopkins was a rising star and during World War II was the principal aide of Franklin Roosevelt and made great contributions. And let's reflect a little bit on why the Roosevelt administration was so it was so important to them to move away from relief and into recovery, because they did not believe in handouts. They wanted people to work. And this Civil Works Administration, Sean, was the forerunner of what? The WPA. This only lasted 7 months, but it showed the Roosevelt administration that they could stand up a national public jobs program very quickly through these federal reemployment offices and state and local projects. And that became a model for the WPA, which most people think was very successful. and taught people a lot of skills that we used in World War II in a variety, both in civilian defense and in military defense. I should tell everybody, I don't know the answer to the question. I laid in the article that I knew where he stopped, and I know he significantly wrote that stop in his expense accounts, but I don't know why he stopped, and I couldn't find it. And I was thinking someone may know more than I do, because you learn things every day, and I'd love to find out more about that. Here's something that really stumped me, and I must have spent, remember, I was doing this on my own time. So I turned it on and turned it off when other projects came up. I was making a living myself, so this was sort of an avocation. But here's a thing that stumped me, and I wanted to get back to it if we had a moment, and that is this. I knew that Harry Truman drove to Jefferson City. This is his first trip when he was interviewing for the job. But I couldn't figure out how he arrived in Washington on the morning of October 21st at 1724 F Street. I mean, he had to drive all night. And I'm thinking in 1934, I doubt if there were all night gas stations and so on and so forth. And then in the Truman Library, I found a letter written on October 20th to his daughter. And it was written from a train, the National Limited. And I'm saying, well, did he drive back to Independence and catch the train or not? And I couldn't figure it out. So I had to figure out railroading in the 1930s. And I found that the National Limited, which was an air-conditioned train that provided very few stops to Washington, it was sort of an express train, its western terminus was actually in St. Louis. And it confirmed the fact that I had documented that Truman drove from Independence, stopped in Jefferson City, and then drove to St. Louis and parked his car, and then took a train in the late afternoon of October 20th and arrived early in the morning of October 21st. But that 3 sentences that I give you took me about 7 months to try to figure it out in looking at train records from that era.
Why do you think that the reemployment office, the CWA, why do you think they don't get as much attention perhaps as those other programs?
It was a short-lived, the National Reemployment Service was a federally directed effort. And what was occurring was that we were incubating state-run employment offices through an act called the Wagner-Peiser Act, which provided matching grants to states to build these state-run offices. I sort of skipped over that, but it's very confusing period because you had overlapping offices. You had state-run offices, and you had these federal reemployment offices, and their purpose was solely to provide recruitment initially for civil and public works jobs. And the agency itself was terminated in 1939. So it provided little support. But I'll tell you something that's very interesting, and this is I found in my professional career. Harry Truman never lost interest in the United States Employment Service. As a matter of fact, when the United States Employment Service was moved out of the U.S. Department of Labor several different times, back and forth, he made certain under the Reorganization Act of 1939 that the U.S. Employment Service and the Unemployment Insurance Service, because at that time, when Truman in the 1930s, there was no such thing as unemployment insurance. It came about in 1935 through the Social Security Act, but he made certain that those two programs were put together in the U.S. Department of Labor. So I think that because of the short life of these programs, they don't get as much coverage. And again, I said that if you look at scholars who've written about it, they have done a very superficial job. Some have done better than others. I think Alonzo Hanby has done a terrific book in his in treatment of that, but they don't get into the detail that I was sort of looking at. And through that, looking for more detail, I found a lot of more interesting things. And I attribute that job actually, as reemployment director, sort of created for Harry Truman a reputation throughout the state as a new dealer. He wasn't a new dealer at the first. He was a proto-new dealer. But by the end of that tenure, he was full-fledged new dealer. and it, I believe, helped him to meet certain people that would aid him later on. Meeting Harry Hopkins was certainly valuable, not only in his Senate years, but throughout the war in running the Truman Committee. And as you probably know, one of the last things that Harry Truman sent him to meet with Stalin in 1946 to try to resolve some issues with respect to the Potsdam and Yalta Conference, which Hopkins was unsuccessful, but it showed how much confidence he had in some of the people he met early on in Washington. I'll give you one more factoid that I think goes to that if I can. When Harry Truman was in the Senate in his first Senate term, he was driving down Pennsylvania Avenue with an aide, and I write about it in the article. And he turns to him and says, and they were going back to the Senate office building, which is now called the Russell Building. He turns to him and says, "I never thought the first time I went down here to see Senator Clark that I'd be back here in this position." And it really dawned on me that when he came to Washington in October of 1933, and the three times that he came during that period of time, he didn't think he'd ever be in that job in the Senate or vice president or president. And he was reflecting on that job was important to him because it allowed him to meet some of the influence makers in the Roosevelt administration in the salad days of the New Deal.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone for joining us today. If anyone has any further questions, is there a good way they can reach out to you, David?
Yeah, you can put my email up if you like, or you can write Sean. Sean will get it to me.
You can write to me, and I'll pass them on to David. If you want more information about his wonderful article and about Harry S. Truman, please check out the Missouri Historical Review article. Thank you very much again, everyone, and thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Appreciate it very much.